They say money can buy anything except time, except health, except loyalty. I spent 70 years building an empire only to discover that the people who smiled at my table were the same ones poisoning my glass. My name is Victoria Ashford, and this is the story of how I almost died surrounded by doctors, while the only person who tried to save me was the woman nobody saw. I remember the exact moment everything started to crumble. It was a Tuesday morning in late September, the kind of day when Atlanta's humidity clings to your skin like a warning you're too proud to hear. I was sitting in my penthouse office on the 42nd floor, overlooking the city I'd helped build with my telecommunications empire. The skyline stretched before me like a testament to ambition, those glass towers reflecting the morning sun, and I felt what I always felt when I looked at that view: satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. At 73, I'd outlived 3 business partners, 2 recessions, and every doubt anyone ever had about a black woman from the projects making it to the Forbes list. But that morning, something felt wrong. My hands trembled slightly as I signed documents, and a persistent headache had been drilling into my temples for weeks. I told myself it was stress, maybe age finally catching up with my relentless schedule. I'd been working 16-hour days since I was 25. Why would my body suddenly decide to complain now? My assistant Marcus knocked softly before entering, his expression carrying that careful concern people use when they're afraid of offending someone powerful. "Mrs. Ashford, your nephews are here for your 10 o'clock meeting," he said, and I noticed the slight hesitation in his voice, as if he wanted to add something, but thought better of it. Marcus had been with me for 15 years. He knew things without being told. "Send them in," I replied, straightening my posture despite the wave of dizziness that threatened to tilt my world sideways. I wouldn't let them see weakness. Not those boys. Not after what their mother, my late sister Eleanor, had asked of me with her dying breath. "Take care of them, Victoria. They're all I have." Derrick and Malcolm entered my office with the kind of confidence that comes from never having earned anything. My nephews were 38 and 41 respectively, dressed in expensive suits I'd probably paid for indirectly through their generous trust funds. They wore smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, and as they settled into the leather chairs across from my desk, I felt something I'd been ignoring for months: suspicion. "Aunt Victoria, you look tired," Malcolm said, his voice dripping with false concern. He was the older one, the calculated one, with his father's sharp features and his mother's manipulative charm. "We've been worried about you. Those headaches you mentioned last month, they're getting worse, aren't they?" I studied him carefully, decades of reading boardroom opponents making me notice the slight eagerness beneath his sympathetic expression. "I'm fine," I said firmly. "Let's discuss the quarterly projections for the Southeast expansion." But Derrick leaned forward, younger and less subtle than his brother, his brown eyes fixed on me with an intensity that felt invasive. "Aunt Victoria, with all respect, you're not fine. We've noticed you've been forgetting things during meetings, and last week you nearly fainted at the investors' dinner. We think it's time you see a specialist." The room seemed to tilt slightly, and I gripped the armrest of my chair to steady myself. They were right about the symptoms, which made me angry. I hated being vulnerable, hated the idea that my body might be betraying me after all these years of perfect discipline. I'd built an empire by never showing weakness, by outthinking and outworking everyone around me. And now my own biology was staging a coup. "I have a personal physician," I said coldly. "Dr. Rains has been monitoring my health for 20 years. Dr. Rains is 79 and still using medical textbooks from the 90s. Malcolm countered smoothly, pulling out his phone and sliding it across the desk toward me. On the screen was a profile for Dr. Sebastian Crane, with credentials from Johns Hopkins and a list of prestigious positions at private medical facilities. Dr. Crane specializes in complex diagnostic cases for high-profile clients. He's discreet, brilliant, and available. We've already arranged a consultation for this afternoon. Something about the way they'd orchestrated this entire conversation made my instincts scream warning. But the throbbing in my head was getting worse, and I was so tired of fighting everything all the time. Maybe they were right. Maybe I needed someone who understood the unique pressures of my lifestyle, someone who could fix whatever was breaking inside me without the media circus that would follow if I checked into a regular hospital. "Fine," I heard myself say, and I watched relief flash across both their faces, too quick and too intense for simple familial concern. "Schedule it." They left shortly after, and I sat alone in my office, staring at Dr. Crane's credentials on the phone they'd conveniently left behind. Something felt orchestrated, too neat, too prepared. But the pain in my head was making it hard to think clearly, and when I tried to stand to look out at my beloved skyline, my legs wobbled like I was standing on the deck of a ship in rough seas. Dr. Sebastian Crane arrived at my penthouse that evening with the smooth confidence of someone who treated the ultra-wealthy regularly. He was in his mid-50s, silver-haired with piercing blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything about me within seconds. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, his voice cultured with traces of a New England upbringing, and he carried a medical bag that looked more like luxury luggage than a doctor's kit. "Mrs. Ashford, it's an honor," he said, and I noticed he didn't use my first name without permission, a small detail that indicated either genuine respect or well-trained salesmanship. "Your nephews have briefed me on your symptoms. I'd like to run some preliminary tests this evening and schedule a full diagnostic panel at my private facility tomorrow." "What do you think is wrong with me?" I asked directly, because I'd never been one to dance around difficult subjects. Dr. Crane settled into the chair across from where I sat in my living room, surrounded by the African art collection I'd spent decades assembling, each piece a reminder of roots I'd never forgotten despite the towers I'd built. "At your age and with your stress levels, we're looking at several possibilities," he said carefully. "Hypertension complications, early-stage neurological issues, possibly autoimmune responses. I won't speculate without proper testing, but I can tell you that your symptoms are serious enough to require immediate attention." The preliminary examination was thorough, or at least it seemed that way to me. He checked my blood pressure, listened to my heart, examined my eyes and reflexes, drew blood samples with practiced efficiency. Throughout it all, he maintained a professional distance that I appreciated, asking questions about my medical history, my daily routine, my diet and exercise habits. When he suggested I start on some medication immediately to manage my blood pressure and prevent potential complications, I didn't question it. The pills were small and white, unremarkable, and he explained their purpose with a kind of technical detail that suggested competence. "Take 2 of these every morning and 1 at night," he instructed, handing me a prescription bottle with my name already printed on the label, which should have struck me as odd, but didn't in my exhausted state. "They'll help stabilize your blood pressure while we wait for the full diagnostic results. You should feel some relief within a few days." I started the medication that night, swallowing the pills with water and crawling into my massive bed surrounded by silence. I'd never married, never had children of my own. My empire had been my baby, raised from nothing through sheer will and strategic brilliance. Now, lying in the darkness of my bedroom with the Atlanta lights glowing beyond my windows, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. My sister was gone. My parents had passed years ago. The nephews were all I had left of family, and despite my suspicions, I wanted to believe they cared about me as more than just a name in a will. The next morning, I felt worse. Not better, as Dr. Crane had promised, but worse. The headache had intensified, and a strange fog seemed to have settled over my thoughts, making it difficult to focus on the documents Marcus brought for my review. My hands trembled more noticeably now, and when I tried to sign my name, the signature looked shaky and uncertain. Nothing like the bold script I'd perfected over decades of signing contracts worth billions. "Mrs. Ashford, should I cancel your afternoon appointments?" Marcus asked, his dark eyes filled with genuine concern that made me want to both accept his care and dismiss it as unnecessary fussing. "No," I said firmly, though my voice sounded weaker than I intended. "Just push them back an hour. I need to take my medication and rest for a moment." But the medication didn't help. Over the next 2 weeks, as Dr. Crane visited my penthouse regularly to monitor my condition and adjust my prescriptions, I felt myself deteriorating in ways that terrified me. My memory started playing tricks, simple names suddenly inaccessible when I needed them. My balance became unreliable, and I had to steady myself against furniture when walking through my own home. The fatigue was overwhelming, turning my usually sharp mind into something sluggish and confused. "These symptoms are concerning," Dr. Crane said during one of his visits, his voice professionally grave as he reviewed test results that meant nothing to me in my foggy state. "I'm seeing markers that suggest a complex autoimmune disorder, possibly lupus or something similar. I'm adjusting your medication protocol to address the inflammation we're detecting." More pills followed, different colors and sizes, each with specific instructions about timing and dosage. I took them obediently, trusting that this educated man with his impressive credentials was doing everything possible to save me. My nephews visited frequently during this period, always with that same expression of concern that I was too sick to analyze properly. They asked about my medication, about Dr. Crane's assessments, about whether I'd updated my estate planning documents given my deteriorating health. That last question should have alarmed me, but I was so tired and confused that I simply nodded and said something vague about having everything in order. The truth was, I'd established my nephews as primary beneficiaries years ago, after Eleanor died, and I'd promised to take care of her boys. My fortune would be split between them. With substantial donations to various educational and cultural institutions I'd supported throughout my career. At the time, it had seemed right, appropriate. Now, lying in my bed most days because standing was too exhausting, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. The fog got worse. Days blurred together. I remember fragments. Marcus bringing meals I couldn't finish. Dr. Crane's smooth voice explaining new complications, my nephews' faces hovering above me with expressions I could no longer read clearly. The headaches became constant, a screaming pressure inside my skull that no medication seemed to touch. My hands developed tremors that made it impossible to hold a pen or use my phone. I started forgetting where I was sometimes, waking up confused about whether I was in my bedroom or the hospital or somewhere else entirely. "We need to consider more aggressive treatment," Dr. Crane said. During what might have been the third or fourth week of my decline, I'd lost track of time. "I'd like to admit you to a private medical facility where we can monitor you more closely and try some experimental therapies." "No," I managed to say, though my voice was barely a whisper now. "No hospitals. I want to stay home." The truth was, I was afraid that if I left my penthouse, I'd never come back. Some primitive part of my brain, still functioning beneath the fog, knew that something was deeply wrong, not just with my body, but with the entire situation surrounding my illness. But I couldn't articulate this fear, couldn't form the words to express the suspicion that had been growing even as my cognitive abilities declined. I was trapped inside a failing body, with a mind that knew something terrible was happening, but couldn't figure out what or how to stop it. It was during this period of complete vulnerability that she appeared, though I barely registered her presence at first. Carmen Rodriguez was 22 years old, recently hired to help with housekeeping duties that my regular staff couldn't manage, given my increased medical needs. She was small and quiet, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dressed in the simple uniform all my household staff wore. Her movements were efficient as she cleaned my bedroom, changed my sheets, organized the nightmare of pill bottles that had accumulated on my nightstand. I noticed her hands first, because she was careful and gentle when she had to move things near me, unlike some of the other staff who seemed almost afraid to touch anything in my space. Her hands were young and steady, with short, practical nails and a small scar across one knuckle. Medical student hands, I thought randomly through the fog, though I didn't know why that thought occurred to me. "Mrs. Ashford, can I get you anything?" she asked softly one afternoon, and I realized it was the first time she'd spoken directly to me rather than simply moving silently through my space. "Water," I whispered, my throat dry from the constant medication. She brought it quickly, holding the glass steady while I drank through a straw because my hands shook too much to grip it myself. Her brown eyes were serious and thoughtful, and I noticed she glanced briefly at the array of pill bottles before helping me settle back against my pillows. "Thank you," I managed to say, and she nodded once before returning to her cleaning duties. I drifted back into uncomfortable sleep, unaware that this quiet young woman would soon be the only person standing between me and death, and that her presence in my home was about to unravel a conspiracy I'd been too sick to see forming around me like a noose, drawing slowly tighter. The days continued bleeding into each other, each one worse than the last, and I felt myself slipping away from the world I'd spent 73 years conquering. My empire was running itself now, managed by executives I'd trained, but who seemed increasingly distant, as if they already saw me as a ghost haunting my own legacy. Malcolm and Derrick visited daily, their faces swimming in and out of focus above my bed, their voices discussing my condition in hushed tones that carried through the fog like distant thunder, announcing a storm I couldn't outrun. "The doctors say it's progressing faster than expected," I heard Malcolm say one evening, though I couldn't remember if my eyes were open or closed, if I was truly awake or trapped in another fever dream where reality and nightmare merged into something indistinguishable. "How long?" Derrick's voice, sharper, more eager than concern should sound. "Dr. Crane estimates weeks, maybe a month if we're lucky. The organ systems are starting to fail in cascade. At this point, we're just keeping her comfortable. Comfortable. That word echoed in my deteriorating consciousness like a lie told so many times it almost became truth. I wasn't comfortable. I was dying, and some part of me that still functioned beneath the chemical haze knew this death didn't feel natural, didn't feel right. But knowledge without power is just another form of torture, and I was powerless now, trapped in a body that no longer obeyed me, dependent on people I was starting to fear. Carmen was there more often now, I noticed, though my perception of time had become unreliable. Sometimes she was cleaning, sometimes sitting quietly in the corner of my room reading while I slept, sometimes helping me drink water or adjust my pillows when I couldn't do it myself. Unlike the other staff who moved through my space with practiced efficiency but emotional distance, she seemed genuinely present, watching me with those serious brown eyes that reminded me of someone, though I couldn't remember who. One afternoon, when consciousness returned after what might have been hours or days of absence, I found her standing at my nightstand, holding one of my pill bottles and reading the label with intense concentration. The fog in my mind cleared slightly, and I watched her open the bottle, examine the pills inside, then carefully return it to its precise position before pulling out her phone and photographing the label. "What are you doing?" I tried to ask, but my voice came out as barely a whisper, and she didn't seem to hear me. She moved to the next bottle, repeating the process, her movements quick but careful, making sure everything was returned exactly as she'd found it. There was something methodical about her actions, something that suggested more than casual curiosity. She was investigating, documenting, searching for something she suspected but couldn't yet prove. When she finally turned and saw my eyes were open and watching her, she froze, guilt and determination warring across her young face. For a long moment we stared at each other, this dying billionaire and this housekeeper who'd just been caught doing something that could cost her the job she obviously needed. Then she did something unexpected. She walked over to my bed and sat carefully on the edge, close enough that I could see the intelligence burning in her eyes, the fear and conviction mixing into something brave and possibly foolish. "Mrs. Ashford," she whispered urgently, glancing toward my closed bedroom door, "I need you to listen to me carefully. I don't think you're dying from natural causes. I think someone is poisoning you." The words took a moment to penetrate the fog, and when they did, I felt a jolt of something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Clarity. Sharp, painful, terrifying clarity that cut through the chemical haze like lightning through storm clouds. I tried to speak, but she put a gentle finger to her lips, her eyes darting toward the door again. "I can't prove it yet," she continued in that same urgent whisper, "but the medications you're taking, some of them shouldn't be prescribed together." I recognized the combinations because I was studying pharmacology before I had to drop out. These drugs are creating the symptoms that are killing you, not treating any actual disease. My mind struggled to process this information, fighting through the fog to grasp what she was telling me. Poisoning, medication, combinations. I wanted to ask her 1,000 questions, but my mouth wouldn't form the words properly, and all that came out was a confused sound that might have been, "Why?" "I don't know who or why yet," Carmen said, understanding my broken question, "but I'm going to figure it out. I need you to trust me, and I need you to try not to take the evening medications tonight if you can avoid it. Can you do that? Can you pretend to take them, but hide the pills instead?" I managed a small nod, though even that movement sent waves of dizziness crashing through my skull. She squeezed my hand gently, her grip strong and warm and alive, in a way that made me realize how cold I'd become, how close to death I'd drifted without even understanding the current pulling me under. "I'm going to save you," she said with the kind of fierce determination that reminded me of myself 40 years ago, back when I was young and brilliant and convinced I could change the world through sheer force of will. "I promise, Mrs. Ashford. I'm going to figure out what they're doing to you and make it stop." She left then, returning to her cleaning duties as if nothing had happened, and I lay there in my bed staring at the ceiling, feeling my mind start to clear slightly as her words worked their way through my consciousness. Poisoning. Not dying naturally, but being murdered slowly, methodically, by someone who had access to my home, my medication, my trust. The fog tried to pull me back under, but I fought it, clinging to the clarity Carmen had given me like a drowning person clinging to driftwood in stormy seas. That evening, when my nephews arrived with Dr. Crane for the usual medication administration ritual that had become part of my daily decline, I watched them differently. Malcolm's expensive suit and practiced concern, Derrick's eager hovering, Dr. Crane's smooth professional manner as he checked my vital signs and prepared the evening dose of pills that I was supposed to swallow obediently like a good patient accepting her fate. "How are you feeling today, Victoria?" Dr. Crane asked, and I noticed for the first time that he'd started using my first name without permission, a subtle shift in power dynamic that suggested he no longer saw me as a client, but as a dying woman whose opinion no longer mattered. "Tired," I whispered, which was true but also useful, giving me an excuse for the confusion I was about to fake. He handed me the pills, 6 of them tonight, different colors that would have been beautiful if they weren't killing me. Malcolm held the water glass, and I made a show of taking the pills, letting them touch my tongue briefly before pretending to swallow, then accepting the water and drinking it down while the pills sat hidden in my cheek like toxic secrets. It was harder than I expected, fighting every instinct to simply obey the doctor's orders, trusting that I could pull off this deception while my body screamed for the chemical dependence these pills had created. "Good," Dr. Crane said, checking something on his tablet. "I'm adjusting the morning dose slightly based on her latest blood work. Her liver enzymes are showing concerning patterns, which is consistent with the autoimmune cascade we've been tracking." Lies, I thought through the fog. All lies wrapped in medical terminology designed to sound authoritative and beyond questioning. How long had they been doing this? Since the beginning? Had I ever been sick naturally? Or had this entire nightmare been orchestrated from that first meeting in my office when my nephews had presented Dr. Crane as the solution to problems they'd probably created? After they left, I carefully spit the pills into my hand, staring at them with a mixture of horror and rage. These small colored tablets had been destroying me from the inside, turning my strong body into something weak and failing, stealing my mind piece by piece until I wouldn't even remember who I'd been or what I'd built. I wanted to throw them across the room, to scream, to call the police immediately, and watch my nephews and their hired killer in a white coat get dragged away in handcuffs. But I was too weak for rage, and too smart even in my diminished state to act without evidence. Carmen had said she needed to prove what was happening, which meant she understood that accusations without proof would be dismissed, especially accusations from a housekeeper against wealthy men with credentials and connections. So I hid the pills in a tissue and tucked them under my mattress, then lay back exhausted from even that small act of defiance, waiting for morning to come and hoping Carmen knew what she was doing. The next few days were torture of a different kind. Without the evening medications, my body went through withdrawal symptoms that Carmen had quietly warned me about, whispering information during her cleaning duties when we were alone. The shaking got worse before it got better. The confusion intensified temporarily as my system fought to rebalance itself, and there were moments when I nearly gave up and took the pills just to make the suffering stop. But Carmen was there, appearing at odd hours, bringing me water and quiet encouragement, telling me what to expect, and assuring me that the worst would pass if I could just hold on. She was risking everything, I realized, staying in my room far longer than her duties required, potentially exposing herself to suspicion if anyone questioned why the housekeeper seemed so invested in the dying billionaire's care. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to ask her one night when the withdrawal tremors were so bad I couldn't stop shaking, and she was holding my hand to anchor me through the worst of it. She was quiet for a long moment, and in the dim light from my bedside lamp, I saw tears gathering in her eyes, because I know what it's like to watch someone die when you know something's wrong, but nobody believes you, she finally said, her voice breaking slightly. "My father died 6 months ago. The doctor said it was heart failure, natural progression of his diabetes, but I knew something was off about his medications. I tried to tell them, but I was just a nursing student with 1 year of school completed, and they were certified physicians. They dismissed me, and he died anyway. I dropped out to work and pay off his medical bills, and I promised myself I'd never stay silent again if I saw something wrong. Her pain was raw and real, and I understood then that this wasn't just about saving me. It was about redemption, about proving that her knowledge mattered even without the credentials that society demanded. She was fighting for her father's memory and her own worth as much as she was fighting for my life, and that made her dangerous in the best possible way. People with nothing left to lose and everything to prove are the ones who change the world. "What's your plan?" I asked, my voice stronger than it had been in days, as my body slowly started to clear itself of the poison they'd been feeding me. Carmen pulled out her phone, showing me photographs she'd taken of all my medication bottles, along with notes she'd been making about dosages and timing. I've been documenting everything and researching these drug combinations. Most of them are legitimate medications, but prescribed in combinations and dosages that create toxic interactions. The digoxin you're taking for heart regulation, combined with the amiodarone they added last week, creates a dangerous accumulation that mimics heart disease. The lithium they prescribed for mood stabilization at that dosage, combined with the diuretics they're giving you, is destroying your kidney function. It's brilliant in a horrible way, because each drug individually looks reasonable, but together they're creating cascade organ failure that looks like natural disease progression. I listened as she explained the chemical warfare being waged inside my body, her knowledge impressive for someone with only 1 year of medical school. She'd clearly been studying obsessively, teaching herself what she needed to know to understand and prove what was happening to me. It reminded me of myself decades ago, learning everything I could about telecommunications technology because I refused to build an empire in an industry I didn't completely understand. "But we need more than my notes and photographs," she continued. "We need independent blood work analyzed by a lab that isn't connected to Dr. Crane. We need documentation of who's prescribing these medications and who's benefiting from your death. And we need to do all of this without tipping them off that you're getting better instead of worse." "My lawyer," I said, my mind finally clear enough to start thinking strategically again. "Jonathan Kress at Kress & Associates. He's handled my legal matters for 30 years. Call him tomorrow, tell him I need to see him privately, and tell him to bring someone who can draw blood properly and get it analyzed independently. Use my personal phone to call, the one in my nightstand drawer. The number is programmed under JK. Carmen nodded, memorizing the instructions. "What should I tell him about why you need this?" "Tell him I suspect I'm being poisoned and I need proof before I can act. Jonathan has known me long enough to take that seriously, and he's ruthless enough to help me destroy whoever's responsible." I felt strength returning to my voice with each word, the old Victoria Ashford starting to emerge from the fog that had almost claimed her permanently. "And Carmen, when this is over and we prove what they've done, I'm going to make sure you finish your education and become the doctor your father would have been proud of. That's a promise." She smiled then, really smiled, and I saw the brilliant future she deserved shining in her eyes, the one that had been derailed by tragedy and financial hardship, but wasn't destroyed, just delayed. We were both fighters, both women who'd been underestimated, both survivors of systems designed to keep us invisible and powerless. Together, we were going to burn down the conspiracy that had tried to bury me alive. The next morning, Carmen made the call to Jonathan from my personal phone while I pretended to be sleeping. I could hear her quiet voice in the bathroom explaining the situation, her words careful and precise. And then, Jonathan's louder response, even through the phone, his distinctive baritone carrying the shock and rage I knew would follow my revelation. Within an hour, he'd arranged for a private medical technician to visit, disguised as a physical therapist to avoid suspicion. The blood draw happened during what would normally be my afternoon rest period, when staff was minimal and my nephews weren't scheduled to visit. The technician, a competent woman in her 50s who asked no unnecessary questions, filled multiple vials with my blood, labeled them carefully, and disappeared with the same professional discretion that had brought her. Jonathan promised results within 2 days from an independent laboratory he trusted, along with a full legal strategy once we had proof of the poisoning. "Victoria," he'd said quietly before leaving, his weathered face showing the concern of someone who'd known me through divorces and business wars and every crisis in between. "If what you're saying is true, we're talking about attempted murder and conspiracy. Your nephews could go to prison for decades. Are you prepared for that? They tried to kill me for my money, I'd responded, my voice cold with the kind of controlled fury that had made competitors fear me in boardrooms. I'm prepared to watch them burn for it. Those 2 days waiting for the blood work results were excruciating, not physically anymore because my body was slowly recovering now that I'd stopped taking the poison, but emotionally and strategically. I had to continue pretending to deteriorate, had to fake the confusion and weakness that would convince Malcolm, Derrick, and Dr. Crane that their plan was still working. Carmen coached me through the performance, teaching me which symptoms to emphasize, how to make my voice sound weaker than it was, how to fake tremors that were actually getting better. Dr. Crane visited daily, and each time I had to pretend to swallow his pills while actually hiding them, had to listen to his smooth lies about my declining condition while rage built inside me like pressure in a sealed container approaching explosion. My nephews came in the evenings, discussing funeral arrangements in hushed voices they thought I couldn't hear, dividing up my empire before I was even dead. Their greed so naked now that I couldn't believe I'd ever mistaken it for concern. The memorial service should be at the cathedral, Malcolm said one evening, his voice carrying through my partially open bedroom door. Major presence, all the business leaders, maybe even the governor. We need to position ourselves properly for when we take over the company. Agreed, Derrick responded. But we need to move quickly once she's gone. There are board members who might question our capacity to run things. We need to demonstrate control immediately. Listening to them plan my funeral and their takeover while I lay supposedly dying was a special kind of torture. But it also gave me something valuable. Evidence of motive and intent. Carmen was recording everything on her phone, building a case that would be impossible to deny once we combined it with the blood work proving the poisoning. On the 3rd day after the blood draw, Jonathan returned with his findings, and his face told me everything before he even opened his mouth. Carmen had arranged to be cleaning my room during his visit, close enough to hear everything but appearing invisible to anyone who glanced in. Victoria, the toxicology report confirms multiple pharmaceutical agents in your blood at levels consistent with intentional overdosing, Jonathan said, his lawyer's precision barely containing his fury. The combinations are creating exactly the organ failures and neurological symptoms you've been experiencing. This isn't medical malpractice. This is attempted murder executed through deliberate pharmaceutical poisoning. He spread the laboratory reports across my bed, and even with my medical knowledge limited to what Carmen had taught me, I could see the damning evidence in those numbers. Every medication Dr. Crane had prescribed was present in my system at toxic levels, their interactions creating the perfect storm of symptoms that mimicked natural disease while actually being calculated chemical warfare. We have enough to go to the police, Jonathan continued, but I'd recommend we gather additional evidence first, specifically documentation linking your nephews to Dr. Crane and proving they knew about the poisoning rather than being fooled by a corrupt doctor. Right now we can prove the poisoning, but without that connection, your nephews could claim they were victims of Dr. Crane's deception, just like you were. I looked at Carmen, who nodded slightly, understanding what needed to happen next. We need to catch them admitting what they've done, I said, my voice stronger now than it had been in weeks. We need a confession, recorded proof that this was intentional murder for financial gain. That's dangerous, Jonathan warned. If they suspect you're onto them, they might accelerate their timeline or become violent. They already tried to kill me slowly, I pointed out. How much more dangerous can it get? Besides, I didn't build a telecommunications empire by playing it safe. Carmen, do you still have that recording app on your phone? She nodded, already understanding what I had in mind. And I can position myself in the bathroom with the door cracked during their next visit. They never notice me anyway. Invisible, remember? Invisible until the moment we destroy them, I said, feeling the old Victoria Ashford returning fully now, the woman who'd crushed competitors and built impossible things through sheer determination and strategic brilliance. Get ready. Tonight, we're going to give my dear nephews exactly what they deserve. The trap was set with the same precision I'd used to structure billion-dollar deals, except this time the stakes weren't money or market share, but justice and survival. Jonathan left with instructions to have police standing by, ready to move the moment we had recorded proof of conspiracy. Carmen positioned herself in my bathroom with her phone recording, the door cracked just enough to capture audio while keeping her hidden from view. And I lay in my bed, weak but clear-minded now, preparing to give the performance of my life. Malcolm and Derrick arrived at 7 that evening, earlier than usual, and I knew immediately from their expressions that something had shifted. There was an urgency in their movements, a tension that suggested timelines accelerating, plans moving into final phases. Dr. Crane followed minutes later, his medical bag in hand, his smooth professional mask firmly in place. "Aunt Victoria," Malcolm began, settling into the chair beside my bed with false gentleness. "Dr. Crane has some news about your condition. We wanted to be here when he explained it to you." I let my eyes flutter weakly, playing the role of dying woman perfectly, because I'd spent weeks actually living it. "What news?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Doctor." Crane opened his bag with practiced efficiency, pulling out several syringes already filled with clear liquid that caught the lamplight like promises of peace. "Victoria, your organ systems are failing faster than we anticipated," he said, his voice professionally compassionate in that way doctors use when delivering death sentences. "Your kidneys are barely functioning, your liver enzymes indicate severe damage, and your heart is showing dangerous arrhythmias. At this point, aggressive intervention would only prolong suffering." "What are you suggesting?" I asked, though I already knew, could see it in the way Derrick leaned forward eagerly, in how Malcolm's hands gripped the arms of his chair with barely contained anticipation. "We make you comfortable," Dr. Crane said smoothly, holding up one of the syringes. "This is a combination of medications that will ease your pain and allow you to slip away peacefully, surrounded by family who love you. It's time, Victoria. Your body has fought long enough. Euthanasia disguised as mercy." The final act of their murder play, administered with clinical precision and witnessed by grieving family members who would swear it was her wish, that she'd suffered enough, that this was kindness rather than the final dose of poison designed to finish what months of careful pharmaceutical warfare had started. "I'm scared," I whispered, and it wasn't entirely performance. Facing death intentionally inflicted by people who were supposed to love you, that brought a special kind of terror that no amount of wealth or power could shield against. "There's nothing to be scared of," Malcolm said, taking my hand with fingers that felt cold despite the room's warmth. "You've lived an incredible life, built an amazing legacy. Now you can rest. We'll take care of everything, just like you took care of us all these years." The irony of those words, the pure audacity of promising to care for my legacy while actively murdering me to steal it, might have made me laugh if the situation weren't so horrific. Instead, I let tears leak from my eyes, real tears born of rage and betrayal, and the death of whatever familial love I'd fooled myself into believing existed. "Before I go," I said softly, my voice trembling with emotion that was completely genuine, even if its source wasn't what they thought, "I need to know something. Did I do right by you boys? Did I take care of you like Eleanor asked me to?" I watched Malcolm and Derrick exchange glances, some silent communication passing between them. And then Malcolm squeezed my hand with manufactured warmth. "Aunt Victoria, you gave us everything. The trust funds, the education, the connections. You kept your promise to Mom completely. But it wasn't enough, was it?" I pressed, letting confusion color my voice. "You needed more. You needed it all, and you needed it now rather than waiting for nature to take its course." The room went very still. Dr. Crane's hand froze halfway to preparing the injection site on my arm. Malcolm's manufactured warmth drained from his face, replaced by something colder, more calculating. Derrick stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a verdict being delivered. "What are you talking about?" Malcolm asked carefully, his voice losing all pretense of affection. "I'm talking about how you've been poisoning me for months," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, the dying woman facade dropping away like a mask I no longer needed. "I'm talking about how you hired Dr. Crane to slowly kill me with pharmaceutical combinations designed to mimic natural disease. I'm talking about attempted murder, motivated by greed so profound you couldn't even wait for an old woman to die naturally." Dr. Crane moved first, lunging toward me with the syringe still in his hand, but I'd anticipated that. My finger pressed the medical alert button sewn into my mattress, a security measure Jonathan had insisted on installing years ago that I'd forgotten about until planning this confrontation. Alarms erupted throughout the penthouse immediately, and within seconds, my personal security team was crashing through the bedroom door. 3 former police officers who'd been stationed nearby, waiting for exactly this moment. "Get away from her!" Marcus shouted, And I'd never been so grateful for my assistant's protective instincts as he physically interposed himself between Dr. Crane and my bed, his tall frame suddenly seeming much more intimidating than his usual professional demeanor suggested. Malcolm made a run for the door, but one of the security officers caught him easily, wrestling him against the wall with practiced efficiency. Derrick stood frozen, his face cycling through panic and calculation as he tried to find an escape route that didn't exist. Dr. Crane dropped the syringe, his hands raised in surrender, but his eyes were already working on whatever story might save him, whatever lies might create reasonable doubt. "This is absurd," he said, his voice projecting outraged innocence. "I've been treating Mrs. Ashford in good faith based on legitimate medical assessment. If there's been any adverse reaction to the medications, that's tragic, but not criminal." "Carmen, you can come out now," I called toward the bathroom, and I watched their faces as she emerged with her phone held up, its recording light still blinking red. "Got everything," she said quietly, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline that must have been flooding her system. Every word, including Dr. Crane offering euthanasia medication to hasten Mrs. Ashford's death, and Malcolm's implicit acknowledgement of the poisoning when she directly accused them. The color drained from Malcolm's face so completely he looked like he might faint. Derrick started talking immediately, the words tumbling out in desperate self-preservation. This was Malcolm's plan, not mine. I wanted to wait, let nature take its course, but he insisted we speed things up. Dr. Crane approached us 6 months ago with the scheme. I barely participated. "Shut up!" Malcolm screamed at his brother, and there it was, the final collapse of their alliance, rats turning on each other as the ship sank beneath them. Jonathan entered then, with 2 police detectives I recognized from charity functions, their badges displayed, and expressions professionally neutral as they assessed the chaos of my bedroom. "Mrs. Ashford, are you all right?" Detective Morrison asked, a woman in her 40s whose reputation for thorough investigation had earned her multiple commendations. "I'm alive, which is better than I would have been if they'd succeeded," I said, sitting up fully now, my strength returning with each moment of freedom from their poison. "I have toxicology reports proving pharmaceutical poisoning, recordings of conspiracy admission, and witnesses to attempted euthanasia administration. Is that sufficient to arrest these gentlemen?" "More than sufficient," Detective Morrison confirmed, nodding to her partner, who began reading Malcolm his rights, while another officer did the same for Derrick and Dr. Crane. I watched my nephews being handcuffed, these boys I'd raised after my sister died, these men I'd given everything to who'd repaid me with calculated murder. Part of me wanted to feel something, some residual love or regret, or familial obligation that might soften the satisfaction of watching them destroyed. But all I felt was cold justice and the grim vindication of survival against people who'd assumed I was too old, too sick, too vulnerable to fight back. "How long have you known?" Malcolm asked as they led him past my bed, his voice carrying genuine curiosity beneath the hatred burning in his eyes. "Long enough," I replied. "Long enough to document everything, to build an unbreakable case, to make absolutely certain that you'll spend decades in prison contemplating exactly how badly you miscalculated when you decided to murder someone smarter than you'll ever be. You're a bitter old woman who was going to die alone anyway," he spat back, venom replacing the manufactured concern he'd performed so well for months. "All that money, all that power, and you'll still die with nobody who actually loves you." His words were designed to wound, and in another life they might have. But I'd spent 73 years building my worth on achievement rather than affection, on respect rather than love, and I'd made peace with that choice decades ago. "Perhaps," I acknowledged calmly, "but I'll die on my own terms, in my own time, having watched my would-be murderers go to prison. That's better than most people get." They took him away then, his protests echoing down the hallway until distance swallowed them completely. Derrick went quietly, already calculating angles and plea bargains, already preparing to testify against his brother in exchange for reduced sentences. Dr. Crane maintained his professional composure, even in handcuffs, but his career was finished, his medical license would be revoked, and his sophisticated murder scheme would be studied in criminal justice courses as an example of medical system abuse. When the police and their prisoners were gone, my bedroom felt larger somehow, as if removing their toxic presence had literally expanded the space. Carmen stood near the window, her phone still clutched in her hand, her body trembling slightly with the adrenaline crash following extreme stress. Marcus hovered nearby, his protective instincts still engaged, checking me over with worried eyes. "Are you really okay, Mrs. Ashford?" he asked, and I heard the genuine concern in his voice, the affection born of 15 years working together, of loyalty that hadn't been purchased but earned through mutual respect. "I'm going to be," I assured him. "Once we get these poison medications out of my system completely and reverse the damage they've done. Jonathan, I'll need you to review my will immediately and remove Malcolm and Derrick entirely. Their portions go to the educational foundation we discussed, and I want provisions established for medical students facing financial hardship." Jonathan nodded, already making notes on his tablet. "Consider it done. And Victoria, for what it's worth, I'm sorry this happened. I should have noticed something was wrong sooner." "Nobody noticed except Carmen," I said, turning to look at the young woman who'd saved my life through intelligence, courage, and refusal to let herself remain invisible when witnessing injustice. "Carmen, come here, please." She approached hesitantly, as if still uncertain of her place in this world of wealth and power where she'd been hired as invisible labor. I took her hand, feeling the strength in her grip, seeing the brilliant future I was about to make possible shining in her determined eyes. "You saved my life when 20 specialists and everyone around me either participated in killing me or failed to see what was happening," I said clearly, making sure Jonathan and Marcus heard every word as witnesses to this promise. "I told you I'd fund your education, and I meant it, but that's just the beginning. Jonathan, establish a full scholarship fund in Carmen Rodriguez's name, covering her undergraduate completion, medical school, and residency with living expenses. And Carmen, when you graduate, if you choose to, there's a position waiting for you in my company's medical research division." Tears were streaming down her face now, and she tried to speak but couldn't get words past the emotion closing her throat. I understood. This was the moment when everything changed, when the trajectory of her life shifted from struggle and limitation to possibility, unlimited by anything except her own ambition and ability. "Why?" she finally managed to whisper. "Why would you do all this for me?" "Because you saw me when everyone else looked through me," I replied simply. "Because you had the courage to act when action could have cost you everything. Because intelligence and integrity deserve to be rewarded regardless of someone's starting position in life. And because 40 years ago, someone gave me a chance when they didn't have to, and I've been waiting for the right person to pay that gift forward to. You're that person, Carmen." She hugged me then, this young woman who'd been my housekeeper and became my savior, and I held her while she cried tears that were equal parts relief and joy and the overwhelming emotion of dreams suddenly becoming tangible reality. Marcus was crying too, I noticed, and even Jonathan had to clear his throat several times and look away, his lawyer's composure cracking under the weight of genuine emotion. The next weeks were a whirlwind of medical treatment, legal proceedings, and media management. My private physicians, real ones this time thoroughly vetted by Jonathan and Carmen working together, worked to reverse the damage the poisoning had caused. My kidney function improved slowly, my liver enzymes normalized, the neurological symptoms faded as the toxic medications left my system. I'd been closer to death than even I realized, the doctors told me soberly. Another few weeks on that pharmaceutical cocktail, and the organ damage would have been irreversible. The media went insane when the story broke, as I'd known they would. Billionaire nearly murdered by nephews made international headlines, spawning countless think pieces about family wealth, elder abuse, and the vulnerabilities of the ultra-wealthy. I gave exactly one interview to a respected journalist I'd known for years, telling my story clearly and completely, ensuring that Carmen's role was properly documented and celebrated. "How do you feel about your nephews now?" the journalist asked during our interview, her camera capturing my response for posterity. I considered the question carefully, searching my heart for any residual affection or familial obligation that might complicate my answer. I found none. "I feel nothing," I said honestly. "They stopped being family the moment they decided to murder me. Now they're simply criminals receiving appropriate justice. I hope their prison sentences are long enough for them to contemplate exactly what they traded their freedom and integrity for, and whether my money was worth spending the best years of their lives in a cell." Malcolm and Derrick's trial was swift and brutal, their defense attorneys unable to counter the overwhelming evidence Carmen and I had gathered. The recordings were damning, The toxicology reports irrefutable. Dr. Crane's testimony as part of his own plea bargain, sealing their fate completely. They were convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and elder abuse, among other charges. The judge sentenced them to 30 and 28 years respectively, and I attended their sentencing to watch justice delivered. Malcolm stared at me with pure hatred as they led him away, but I felt only cold satisfaction. I'd survived their attempt to erase me, and now they would spend decades being erased themselves, forgotten in prison while the world moved on without them. Their mother would have been devastated, I thought briefly, but Eleanor was gone, and I'd fulfilled my promise to take care of her boys. I'd given them every opportunity to become good men, and they'd chosen to become murderers instead. That choice and its consequences belonged entirely to them. Dr. Sebastian Crane received 15 years and permanent medical license revocation, his sophisticated murder scheme earning him notoriety in criminal medical circles and ensuring he'd never practice medicine again. His cooperation had reduced his sentence slightly, but not enough to matter. He'd be an old man by the time he regained freedom, his prestigious career destroyed completely by greed and the willingness to subvert medical knowledge for profit. 6 months after my near-death experience, I stood in the gleaming lecture hall at Johns Hopkins Medical School, watching Carmen receive awards for academic excellence in her renewed medical studies. She'd thrived since returning to education, her intelligence and determination making her a standout student whose professors already predicted an exceptional career. The scholarship fund bearing her name had helped 12 other students return to interrupted educations, and applications were flooding in from around the country. "Mrs. Ashford," Carmen said when she found me after the ceremony, her arms full of flowers and accolades, her face glowing with achievement. "Thank you for coming. It means everything to have you here." "I wouldn't have missed it," I assured her. "You're going to change medicine, Carmen. You're going to bring the perspective of someone who understands what it means to be dismissed and overlooked, and that's going to make you the kind of doctor who actually sees patients instead of just treating symptoms." She hugged me tightly. This brilliant young woman whose courage had saved my life and whose future I'd helped secure. We'd stayed close over the months, developing a relationship that transcended gratitude or obligation and became genuine friendship built on mutual respect. She reminded me of myself at her age, hungry and determined, and refusing to let circumstances define her limitations. My health continued improving, my body recovering from the systematic poisoning that had nearly killed me. I returned to work gradually, reclaiming my empire with the same fierce intelligence that had built it. But something had changed in how I approached my life and legacy. The experience of being vulnerable, of nearly dying while people I trusted plotted my murder, had given me perspective on what actually mattered. I established the Ashford Foundation for Medical Ethics, focusing on preventing elder abuse and improving oversight of private medical care for wealthy patients. I funded research into pharmaceutical abuse patterns and created whistleblower protection programs for medical staff who witnessed malpractice. My near-death experience became the catalyst for systemic change, turning personal trauma into public good. I also rewrote my will extensively, leaving my fortune divided between charitable causes I believed in and people who'd earned my respect through loyalty and integrity. Marcus received a substantial bequest, his 15 years of faithful service recognized properly. Jonathan was named executor, tasked with ensuring my wishes were carried out exactly as specified. And Carmen, when she completed her medical degree, would find herself not just employed, but made a junior partner in the medical research division, her future secured by someone who understood what deferred dreams felt like. On the 1-year anniversary of the day Carmen first suspected I was being poisoned, I hosted a small dinner at my penthouse, the same space where I'd nearly died, but which now felt reclaimed, cleansed of toxic presence. Carmen attended with her father's photo in a small frame she carried, wanting him present for this celebration, even though he'd never lived to see her vindicated. Marcus came with his husband, relaxed and laughing in ways he'd never been during his working hours. Jonathan brought his wife, both of them genuinely happy to celebrate survival rather than plan funerals. "A toast," I said, raising my glass to these people who represented the family I'd chosen rather than the one I'd been betrayed by. To Carmen Rodriguez, who saw what others missed and had the courage to act. to second chances and deferred dreams, to justice properly served, and to the understanding that sometimes the people hired to clean your floors are actually the ones who save your life. We drank together, this strange small family assembled through crisis and mutual respect, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in my 73 years of achievement and empire building: contentment. Not the satisfaction of closing a deal or crushing a competitor, but genuine peace with my place in the world and the legacy I was building. Later, after the guests had left and I stood alone looking out at my city's lights, I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. I'd been betrayed by blood relatives, nearly murdered for my money, saved by a housekeeper nobody else saw, and emerged from the experience fundamentally changed. The old Victoria Ashford would have focused entirely on vengeance and rebuilding her walls higher and stronger. This Victoria understood that vulnerability wasn't weakness, and that the people you thought were nothing might actually be everything. My phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "Thank you for tonight and for everything. My dad would have liked you. You're proof that success doesn't have to mean isolation." I smiled, typing back, "Your father raised an extraordinary daughter. I'm honored to have played a small role in her future. Now go study. Those medical boards won't pass themselves." Her response came quickly. "Yes, ma'am. See you next week for our standing lunch date. And Mrs. Ashford, I'm still going to beat you at chess eventually." "Keep dreaming, Dr. Rodriguez," I replied, using the title she'd earn in a few more years, the one she deserved and would achieve through brilliance and determination that no circumstance could permanently derail. I set my phone down and returned to the window, watching Atlanta's lights shimmer in the humid night air. Somewhere in that city, Malcolm and Derrick sat in prison cells, their greed having cost them everything. Somewhere else, Dr. Crane contemplated his ruined career and the decades ahead behind bars. And here in my penthouse, I stood alive and strong, having survived their murder attempt and transformed trauma into purpose. They'd tried to kill me because they thought I was an old woman alone and vulnerable, easy to erase, forgettable except for the fortune I'd leave behind. They'd miscalculated catastrophically, underestimating both my resilience and the value of the people they'd trained themselves not to see. Carmen had been invisible to them right up until the moment she destroyed them, her intelligence and courage making her the perfect instrument of their downfall. I thought about legacy then, about what actually lasted beyond death and what just turned to dust. My telecommunications empire would outlive me, probably under different leadership and bearing different names as markets evolved and technology advanced. My fortune would fund education and justice and medical ethics research long after I was gone. But the thing I was most proud of, the legacy that mattered more than towers and bank accounts, was this. I'd taken a brilliant young woman society had tried to make invisible and given her the tools to shine. I'd transformed my own trauma into systemic change that would help others avoid similar fates. I'd proven that even at 73, nearly murdered and betrayed, I was still capable of fighting back and winning completely. The night stretched ahead, peaceful and full of possibility, and I felt no fear of death anymore. When it came, it would come naturally, on my terms, with my affairs in perfect order and my legacy secured. Until then, I had work to do, lives to impact, systems to change, and a brilliant young doctor to mentor through the final stages of her education. I returned to my desk, pulling up the foundation documents Jonathan had prepared, reviewing the scholarship programs and medical ethics initiatives that would carry my name and values into the future. The work was endless, as it had always been, but now it felt different, purposeful in ways that pure profit and power had never quite achieved. My phone buzzed again. Marcus this time. "Home safe, and thank you for tonight. You looked happier than I've seen you in years." "It's good to have you back, the real you, not the ghost they were creating." "It's good to be back," I typed in response. "And Marcus, thank you for throwing yourself between me and Dr. Crane. That didn't go unnoticed." "Your family," he replied simply. "Real family protects each other. Real family. Not the one I'd been born into or inherited through my sister's death, but the one I'd assembled through crisis and mutual respect and genuine care that transcended professional relationships or financial transactions. This was the family that mattered, the people who saw my value beyond my bank account and would mourn my eventual death for who I was, rather than what I'd owned. I worked late into the night, as I always had, but without the loneliness that had characterized so many years of my life. My empire was secure, my health was returning, my would-be murderers were imprisoned, and my legacy was building towards something that would outlast stone towers and stock portfolios. Carmen Rodriguez would become Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, and she would save lives with the same courage and intelligence she'd used to save mine. She would mentor other overlooked students and speak up when she witnessed injustice, paying forward the gift I'd given her just as I'd paid forward the chance someone gave me decades ago. That chain of opportunity and courage and refusal to stay silent, that was the real legacy, the one that actually mattered. I finally went to bed around 2 in the morning, exhausted but satisfied, sleeping peacefully in the same room where I'd nearly died, reclaimed now as my own space rather than a crime scene. My last thought before sleep took me was simple and profound. I'd survived, and in surviving, I'd built something more valuable than everything they'd tried to murder me for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new opportunities to shape the world according to the values I'd spent 73 years developing. But tonight, I rested as a survivor, a mentor, a builder of legacies that transcended wealth, and a woman who'd learned that sometimes the people hired to clean your floors are actually the ones who save your soul.